Hello, I am Martin Packer. I am the author of The Science of Qualitative Research. This is one of a series of videos about the theory and practice of qualitative research. This video is titled, Please Don't Code. When students learn how to do qualitative research, especially in psychology, they will often be taught to code their data, whether these data are transcripts of an interview or ethnographic field notes. Indeed, it's often assumed that the only way to analyze qualitative data is to code it. For example, Matthew Miles and Michael Huberman have stated that coding is analysis. But what is coding? This was the explanation given by Miles and Huberman. Codes are tags or labels for assigning units of meaning to the information compiled during a study. Codes usually are attached to chunks of various sizes, words, phrases, sentences, or whole paragraphs. For our purposes, it is not the words themselves, but their meaning that matters. But this is confusing, isn't it? Codes are tags or labels, and to code is to assign units of meaning. What exactly is a unit of meaning? And what does it mean to assign it to a chunk? And what does it mean that a chunk could be a word or a phrase or a sentence or a paragraph? It's not clear what exactly it is that we should be coding. Often students are taught to code every line in a transcript, but the lines are completely arbitrary. If you change the margins on a transcript, the lines will change. And notice the last part of this quotation. It is not the words themselves, but their meaning that matters. This is something that is central to coding, the assumption that words and their meaning can be separated, and that ultimately we're not interested in the words, we're interested in the meaning. Coding, in this sense of labeling chunks, is conducted in a wide range of qualitative research approaches. In grounded theory, for example, thematic analysis, interpretative phenomenological analysis, and others. But it's not true that it's the only way to analyze qualitative data. Coding is not used in conversation analysis, in kinds of narrative analysis, in types of discourse analysis, in ethnomethodology, or in the kind of interpretive analysis that I will be exploring. Here is an example of coding. I've taken this excerpt from an article that was published in the journal Qualitative Psychology a few years ago. Let's read the chunk. We don't have the rest of the interview, obviously, but that shouldn't matter because coding is done with each chunk individually. Here there are 2 black senior vice presidents that are women. There are maybe 2 black women that are VPs. I think I'm the only senior director, and there are a couple of directors, and that's it out of a whole organization of 700 people. So what do these words mean? How should we code this chunk? I'll let you think about that for a moment. Well, let me give you a clue. In this study, 3 main themes were identified. The 3 were lack of representation, ghettoization, and tokenism. So this chunk must have been coded as one of these 3. So can you tell me which one? I think you will agree with me that it is extraordinarily difficult to say which of these 3 codes applies to this chunk. Having just a few African American administrators in an organization of 700 people sounds like lack of representation. But at the same time, these few administrators must feel ghettoized. And equally, they sound like they were token hires. So all of these 3 codes seem to fit. The point I'm making is that the meaning of a chunk doesn't depend only on the words in the chunk. It depends also on the context. By context, I mean the rest of the interview, but I also mean the circumstances in which the interviewee shared these words and who he or she was talking with. As it turns out, this chunk was coded lack of representation. The authors wrote, a common environmental manifestation of racial microaggressions in the workplace was lack of representation of black women and other minorities in senior-level corporate roles in corporate organizations where participants were formerly or currently employed. Okay, let's compare the chunk, the code, and the researcher's description of the code. First, it strikes me that the interviewee's words are not in fact a description of an experience. They are statements of facts about the company which the researchers could have obtained perhaps from company records. Second, the relationship between the researcher's description and the interviewee's words is unclear. I'm sure the researchers are describing something real, but it doesn't correspond with the chunk. For example, racial microaggressions are not mentioned at all by the interviewee, at least in this excerpt. Third, the description doesn't explain what lack of representation means, let alone how it is experienced. And so it seems very odd to claim that the description or the code has captured the meaning of the interviewee's words in this chunk. And notice, too, that the interviewee's words have been replaced by the words of the researcher. This is very common in qualitative research coding, but whose words are more important? Don't we conduct qualitative research because we value the words of the people who participate in our research? And yet straight away we replace their words with our own words. Very strange. Many of the problems with coding come from the way that language is assumed to operate by people who code. Coding assumes that meaning is put into words and that analysis involves removing the meaning from the words. It's as though words are a box whose contents is meaning. Certainly we do talk about putting ideas into words or putting experiences into words, but that is not how language actually operates. We can't somehow separate the meaning from the words and then throw the words away. Recall what Miles and Huberman said. For our purposes, they said, it is not the words themselves, but their meaning that matters. That illustrates very clearly this assumption. In coding, we are supposed to attach a code to a chunk and then ignore the chunk, the original words spoken by the interviewee, and pay attention only to the codes. That is to treat language as a container, as a box. But that is not how language works. Let me give you an example of the way that words have different meanings depending on the context. There is an episode in the Netflix show The Crown, a program which is about the royal family in the United Kingdom, in which the Queen writes Philip, her husband, a message that he reads twice. The message says, "Always remember you have a family." The Queen writes this message when Philip is about to leave on a 5-month world cruise, on which he plans to enjoy himself. The first time he reads it, just before leaving on the cruise, it is clear from his reaction that he understands it as a warning to behave himself. This is its meaning. Always remember you have a family. The second time he reads the message, at the end of the trip, he understands it as a comforting reminder of what he can come home to. Always remember you have a family. So meaning is not contained in the words. The meaning of a message varies depending on the setting and on who is reading it. Why do we forget that when we conduct research? I should also say that I've used intonation to help show the meaning in these two different occasions. Intonation is very important, but it's not usually captured in a transcription. Coding generally goes along with comparison. You may have been taught to look for what is common to the words of the various people you have interviewed, for example. Generally, as an interview transcript is coded, it is compared with the transcripts of other interviews, because the favored meanings are the ones that are shared with or common to a bunch of interviews. However, there are big problems with the logic of comparison. To explain why the logic is flawed, let me try a short experiment. I have here 5 statements that I have taken from 5 different interviews, 5 imaginary interviews. Let's read them. The first is, I admire birds. The second, I enjoy playing with my kite. Third, my favorite is the camel. Fourth, I love my pet mouse. And fifth, I'm fascinated by planes. Now, what I'd like you to do is to compare 3 of the statements. Can you compare the first, second, and 5th statements? And now tell me, what is the meaning of bird? You've probably said something like capable of flying. Now let's compare another 3. Can you compare the first, third, and 4th statements? And tell me again, what is the meaning of the word bird? This time, if I'm right, you've probably said something like warm-blooded animal. So does bird mean capable of flight, or does it mean warm-blooded animal? The answer, surely, is that the word bird can mean either of these things, and many more besides. Now, in case that you think that this is a superficial example, I should tell you that it is taken directly from a book on grounded theory by Anselm Strauss and Juliet Corbin. They say there that a bird, a kite, and a plane all have the specific characteristic of being able to fly, and so they can be categorized together as having the capacity to soar in the air. Well, okay, but why did we choose those 3 to compare? Why did we choose to compare a bird, a kite, and a plane? If we'd compared a bird, a camel, and a mouse, our categorization would have been completely different. So the point of this exercise is to show you that the results of a comparison, the similarities that are identified, will depend completely on what we choose to compare. And what we choose to compare will depend on the similarities that we think we see. This is an inherently circular process. Here is another problem with comparison, also taken from the book by Strauss and Corbin. Let's compare swans. Look, all swans are white. White, then, is part of the definition of swan. It's what swans have in common. But as you all know, we need to visit Australia. Now we discover that not all swans are white. These swans are black. There is then no color that is common to all swans. Color then is not part of the definition of swan. A swan could be any color. The logical failure in both of these examples comes from not recognizing the importance of variation. There are diverse ways to be a swan, though not unlimited ways. Swans can be black or they can be white, but they cannot be green so far as we know. Similarly, there are diverse ways to interpret the word bird, but not unlimited ways. The search for similarity and generalization fails to grasp this crucial property of the way we talk about the world and the way we understand the world. And it is the way the world is, too. Surely qualitative researchers need to understand diversity. We should not assume that only what people have in common is important. The way people differ is important, too. So why is coding emphasized so much? Why would a researcher want to take words out of their context and then try to extract from them a fixed meaning, and then replace those words with new words, a description of the meaning that has been written by the researcher? Why would a researcher compare the words spoken by several different people and select only what is common to them, ignoring diversity, ignoring particularity? I think all of this follows from a mistaken view of what qualitative research is. Robert Bogdan and Sari Bicklin stated this view very clearly in 1992, and they said the same thing again in 2007. What qualitative researchers attempt to do is to objectively study the subjective states of their subjects. Is then qualitative research the objective study of subjectivity? If that is what qualitative research is, this will explain why researchers want to abstract words from their context, and why they want to generalize from any particular case, because they believe that objective knowledge is abstract and general. I believe, though, that this view of qualitative research is mistaken. In another video, I will explain why in more detail and offer an alternative. For now, it's sufficient that you can see that coding is based on this problematic idea about qualitative research. This concern with abstraction and generalization can be seen in an important response by coders to what are called indexicals. Indexicals are words like I and you and here and now. Their meaning depends on who is speaking and on the circumstances. With such words, the meaning is evidently not in the words, it depends on the context. For example, for me now, here refers to my office. For you, here would refer to wherever you are. This example from an article published in the journal PLOS One in 2015 illustrates what I mean. On the left are chunks from the interview. Here they are already called meaning units. On the right are the codes. You can see that a major change has been to remove words like I, any, older, to remove, let's just say, precisely the indexical terms. Harold Garfinkel has written about this obsession in social science in avoiding indexical language. It is another indication that coders believe that true knowledge, objective knowledge, must be abstract. Okay, if I've not yet convinced you that coding is a bad idea, consider this. You may remember from a quantitative methods class the idea of levels of measurement: nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. Yes, coding is a level of quantitative analysis. It is nominal measurement. I'm sorry, but when you code, you're actually doing quantitative research. In conclusion then, what have we learned? We've learned that meaning is not in the words that are spoken. Meaning depends on context, both the context of the other words in an interview and the context in which the interview took place. And indexicals are a very clear illustration of the way that meaning depends on context. Meaning also depends on who is speaking, on the intonation with which they speak, and on who is listening as well. Indeed, really, meaning is never fixed. It is always open to interpretation. We've learned that coding loses the context and abstracts words from context. We've learned that coding destroys indexicality. We've seen too that coding is actually a kind of measurement, nominal measurement. And we've seen that the comparison that goes along with coding ignores diversity, ignores particularity. In general, one could say that coding imposes one particular interpretation on words that do not have a single meaning. I imagine that by now you're asking, what is the alternative to coding? Indeed, there are alternatives. They are approaches that acknowledge the ways that language works, including the fact that when people talk, they are generally offering an argument, or offering a narrative, or a combination of the two. This extract is an example from an online demonstration of grounded theory. It is supposed to illustrate coding, but in fact it illustrates the problems that we have discussed. For example, how exactly do the codes on the right relate to the extract on the left? Why only these 4 codes, for example? Then if you read the extract, and I suggest that you pause the video to read it, you will see that the interviewee is making an argument about some reforms to the government in a US state. Notice, in fact, that to understand the transcript, to follow the argument, one needs to know quite a lot about government in the US states. Then notice that the questions that are raised by the researcher, questions such as what officials play the largest role in interpreting these reforms, cannot be answered simply by using the codes. They can, however, be answered by studying and articulating the interviewee's argument. An argument is extended speech. It is not a word, it is not a sentence. The alternatives to coding generally pay attention to the organization of the words that have been spoken by an interviewee in order to understand what was being done by and through speaking. Thank you for watching this video. In others, I will explore the alternatives to coding in more detail. And I'll also be considering what the aims of qualitative research are, if it is not the objective study of subjectivity. Meanwhile, here are some resources that may be helpful. Stay tuned.